Hello and welcome to the Sustainable Remediation Forum webinar. I'm Betsy Collins. I'm the current Vice President of SURF, and I'm so glad that you've taken the time out of your busy day to join us. We have a great presentation lined up for you. Barbara Mako, Kathy Rockwell, and Eric Milbrecht will be presenting on the vulnerability of hazardous waste sites to climate change. For our presentation today, participants will be on mute, but please submit your questions for our speakers throughout the presentation using the question function on the toolbar. We are recording today's call, and a copy of the recording will be available on the SURF YouTube channel. Before we get to the main presentation, I would like to tell you a little bit about SURF. Since its founding in 2006, SURF has worked to address the environmental impacts of remediation by advancing sustainable cleanup practices and developing frameworks and metrics to advance sustainability in environmental remediation with the objective of balancing economic viability, conservation of natural resources, and the enhancement of the quality of life in surrounding communities. If you'd like to learn more about SURF, please check out our website. The link is here. Or you can refer to the brochure that's attached to this meeting as a handout. The purpose of this webinar series is to share knowledge and continue the conversation of sustainable remediation. And so with that in mind, let's get right into it. I'm really pleased to introduce our speakers today. We've got some heavy hitters for you. All three are SURF members, and they're renowned in the field of sustainable remediation. Eric Milbrecht is a directing scientist at EcoAdapt, where he specializes in assessing anthropogenic stresses and the risks that they pose in natural and built environments. And there he is. Kathy Rockwell is a senior technical manager and practice lead at Woodard & Curran and focuses on environmental and hydrogeological investigations, feasibility evaluations of remedial alternatives, and the design and implementation of remedies. And last but certainly not least, Barbara Mako is a sustainability director for Wachter & Wick LLP. She's worked for over 25 years in both the public and private sector to support clients with projects advancing sustainable rehabilitation of impaired lands. And so with that, I think I'm passing the mic over to Barbara. Take it away, guys.
Thank you and welcome. This pilot was born at the National Adaptation Forum during a presentation by SURF and the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. We discussed the opportunity created by Massachusetts Executive Order for Comprehensive Climate Change Adaptation. Thanks to the SURF Board of Trustees for the project seed investment and providing boots on the ground Massachusetts experience. MassDEP wanted to build on the existing work of the state, including vulnerability mapping by Boston University. The project also needed to be aligned with the state regulations and be useful to the state's licensed site professional. Another priority, especially for SURF, was ecosystem and community vulnerability indicators. For this part of the project, we turned to the Mystic River Watershed Association and SURF UK. The pilot and the project results begin to address the need identified by the Government Accountability Office in their 2019 Superfund and Climate Change report to provide direction on integrating the impacts of climate change effects into site-specific risk analysis and responses. Your turn, Eric.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Eric Milbrecht with EcoAdapt. Thank you for that wonderful introduction and kind of painting the scene for us as we kind of step into this project. I do want to acknowledge the large team that was involved in this project, and Barbara, you began to do that. Obviously, Barbara Mako and Kathy Rockwell, key players. Other folks involved besides myself are Tom Potter at MassDEP, who's retired now, but again was a catalyst in getting these ideas up and out, and in support of the Massachusetts governor's executive orders on resilience and climate preparedness. Two folks from Boston University are also key in the number crunching and ideas creation, and actually had a Genesis project before we expanded on it for the whole state, and that was Caitlin Terrio, who is a GIS and data analyst specialist there. She's actually working in remote sensing now. And then Rick Reibstein, who's been with Boston University for years and a creative player in contaminants and toxics management in Massachusetts and elsewhere for many years. So it was a great team to work with, and I also would like to acknowledge SURF for their technical initiative financial support to get this project going, some seed money, which has really helped support creative and new ideas, which we'll share with you today. Again, if there are questions if you have, make sure you type them into the question box. We'll bring them up at the end. We'll leave some time for that discussion afterwards. So hold tight till then, please. And then I hope everyone's technical systems are working well, so let's go smoothly today. So I'd like to start with the questions. I mean, you're all here with your own questions, I'm sure, as an audience. I'm curious about this. You're all SURF members, so you are well-versed in sustainable and resilient remediation ideas and the ideas that SURF has been pioneering. But you might have come in with some of these specific questions, and hopefully we'll have a chance to address some of these and others too. And, how can I evaluate climate-related risks and plan for the future at my sites, in my community, in my agency, in my asset pool? How are other states beginning to address climate change impacts to thousands of hazardous waste sites? This is a daunting challenge, and this project is begins to kind of crack open some approaches and some methodologies hopefully you can take elsewhere. And then what new guidance and resources are emerging? Kathy, after I speak, is going to talk about Massachusetts specifically and some new regulatory guidance that's emerging to specifically address climate change impacts at hazardous waste sites and some of the decision making that needs to go around that. So we'll touch on these. If you have other questions, please do bring them up at the end. Just a quick reminder, I know climate change has been in the media for decades now, slowly gaining more traction and acceptance society-wide. Scientists have obviously known about this and been dealing and analyzing this for quite a while. But some of the big events I think we consider kind of headline events, in 2017, Hurricane Harvey hitting the Gulf Coast and its impact to hazardous waste sites there and the breaches of containment and remedies. Hurricane Florence in 2018, southeast U.S. impacts there, of course, are well known and still being dealt with on both sites. In the West, Iron Mountain Mine is an example of a place that dealt with wildfire. Of course, wildfires are an issue in the West that are climate related and are challenging hazardous waste sites. And the San Jacinto River, again, in the Gulf Coast of Mexico is another good example. So these are challenges, and the media is really good at identifying and amplifying the challenges that are out there and the problems. But and I want to emphasize a little bit what some of the climate change impacts and extreme weather can have on undermining remediation. And then I'll get into some of the ideas around solutions and ideas and planning in just a minute. Physical impacts are straightforward, and I'm assuming for this audience, these are probably very well understood, but I do want to go over them. Obviously, changing precipitation patterns, talking about flooding and mobilization of sediments unexpectedly. Also, drought brings challenges where you do not have receding waters, etc. Sea level rise as a slow, continual impact to coastal areas, and a lot of industrial sites tend to be in coastal and port areas, so they're certainly subject to sea level rise issues. Extreme weather events, extreme flooding, extreme precipitation, etc. Understand those impacts: extreme heat, drying and desiccation of soils, and oxidation in certain areas. Fire, too, in the West is a big kind of acute impact. Physical impacts are pretty straightforward. Toxicological impacts are something to think about. I mean, a lot of the toxicological standards that exist out there and criteria that exist out there are based on environmental assumptions from maybe 20 years ago. The environment around us is changing, and those early bioassays that set those criteria levels were set at certain conditions that may not be relevant to the world outside. If you have coastal sites, due to ocean acidification, you're seeing a decrease in pH globally. That's putting a stress on organisms in marine systems, and then their response to toxic impacts may be different than what had been established in the past. Increasing temperature, too, can bring more stress in a system overall, and organisms in that system may be responding differently to contaminants because of those temperature changes. Again, precipitation changes will affect receiving waters and dilution factors. If you have more drought situations, you have less of a chance for dilution. That might be something that was assumed 10 years ago, but cannot be anticipated or expected in the future. Extreme weather, again, and then human responses to climate change. We are all responding, as a society to these changes. In some cases, that may be we're using more pesticides to manage pests that are emerging in agricultural systems, or might increase an overall load in aquatic systems, for example. So there's kind of these direct physical impacts, but then there's underlying toxicological impacts that we're just beginning to touch upon and need to begin thinking about also. So lots of problems, lots of challenges. These have been identified formally in some cases, like the GAO report, but there are lots of solutions and ideas and creative thinking about how do we address the challenge that society is facing right now. The GAO report identified problems, but also identified a handful of solutions that it suggested to the EPA should take on to do a better job of addressing and managing those risks from climate change. There are numerous publications emerging out there. One is here, Resilient Remediation, Addressing Extreme Weather and Climate Change, Creating Community Value. Some of the authors on this project here are involved in that paper from a few years ago that began to underline adaptation ideas and strategies that help build resilience into systems. Currently, an ongoing, a multi-year process by the Interstate Technology and Regulatory Council, which is building and updating its sustainable and resilient remediation guidance, which is really a gathering of the top thinkers in this area and agency regulators to build some suggestions and guidance that can be used throughout the country to help in the world to help kind of address and build resilience in remedy situations. And of course, EPA has some guidance out there, which has just been recently updating, late 2019, its technical fact sheets around some specific Superfund situations, and those are quite comprehensive, and it's nice to see that. So the adaptation and solution ideas are beginning to emerge and become more codified out there. And this project, again, aims to bring some more information to that process as possible. So I'm going to step down here from kind of a broad view and more into what is this project about, and what are some of our goals. Basic goals here: informing communities and MassDEP of the potential climate change-related vulnerabilities at hazardous waste sites. Again, this is a statewide approach, looking at thousands of sites here. A lot of management is done at a single or a cluster of sites. So again, you have to step back a little bit and think about how do you manage and think about thousands of sites, which agency folks are having to do now. And it's daunting to some degree. And so this project really tries to get a handle on how it can begin to prioritize and rank vulnerability within sites based on an easily accessible set of variables. And of course, with this information, we would hand off to the site managers to build more resilient and sustainable remediation solutions that have short-term and long-term strength to them, so that they are going to stand up to what the future will bring them. The project also looks at a holistic approach here, this triumvirate of environment, society, and economy. From the environment, we moved beyond the site itself and looked at sensitive environmental receptors kind of in vicinity of the area and down gradient of a site. Surrounding community, obviously around and adjacent to each of these sites was considered, and then within that community also key infrastructure components that may be overly sensitive to certain uncontrolled releases were considered. So we tried to expand that conceptual site model to not just the site at the property boundary, but also to the community around that site and down gradient of that site. Because as you're seeing in the media, it's really community impact and response, which we need to be thinking about in these kind of acute uncontrolled release situations, which no one, of course, wants to have happen at their own site. Okay. So again, digging into a bit of the methodology, the goal of this project is a couple-fold, but in a practical sense, the results are useful very specifically for Massachusetts and the sites we looked at, and I'll share that detail with you shortly. But the model itself and how we gather data and a handful of variables to inform this model, I think, is universally applicable. And none of this is rocket science. This is just adapted from climate change vulnerability assessment work that's been out there and well documented over the last decades, and also the risk assessment models that are out there. So we looked at vulnerability at two different ways at the site level. So we constrained it at first to kind of a site boundary in its traditional sense. And we used two components to identify site vulnerability. One is climate change related exposure. There has to be some kind of exposure at that site, which could then potentially have impacts. And the magnitude of those impacts are based on the site sensitivity. And so we have a handful of variables we looked at to identify what may be impacting or related to site sensitivity. So for climate data, specifically in this project, we looked at flooding and inundation. We looked at flooding data from storm precipitation events. We looked at storm surge from hurricanes and other strong surge at the coast area. So these are kind of acute short-term flooding events or seasonal flooding events. We also look at sea level rise, current and future sea level rise. And the data sets for those that we used are below. We were limited to some degree by what data layers are available throughout the state of Massachusetts. A large geographic area, so you have to stand back and see what's available. So we did rely on the FEMA 100 and 500-year flood zone, flood hazard maps. We used U.S. Army Corps of Engineers hurricane surge inundation zones for the coast of Massachusetts because they're universally available along the coast. And we used NOAA sea level rise inundation zone mapping. Again, these data are available. We pulled this from national database, GIS databases, and also the Mass GIS resource online, and the Resilient Mass resources online too, which have data specific to the state. But I'm sure you're curious about site sensitivity. Everyone understands climate impacts to some degree, but how do we begin to address or think about how a site will endure and be resilient to a flooding or inundation event? So again, we had to stand back and look at the data that were available. We used data from MassDEP's Bureau of Waste Site Cleanup, Waste Site Reportable Release Database. This is publicly available online. You can search it, you can download it. It's consistent. It goes back several decades. Of course, consistency in the data set vary over time. But we had to go back and look out for the life of some of these sites, and of the 6,001 sites, I should say. The database itself has tens of thousands of sites. This subset of 6,001 were identified by collaborators at MassDEP as ones that are probably most relevant and useful in their own kind of management decisions. But the variables that we used for site sensitivity include an open or closed status for the site, whether an active remediation system was in place or multiple remediation systems were in place, whether an active exposure pathway, a mitigation measure had been identified or not, or is in place for that site. Again, imminent hazard classification was another one, present or absent, and then critical exposure pathway for human risk. So these are variables that are very specific to Massachusetts DEP approach to managing sites and how they go through a kind of a timeline and sequence of management, of identification and closure eventually. Every state or region will have a different set of variables within their database, but it's good to sit down with the folks who manage those databases and that information to identify what may be relevant, and that's what we were able to do with their support. So this handful of data, not a lot, but enough, but again, consistent over the 6,000 sites and over time, so they're quite useful. The other component, or the second complementary component of vulnerability that we looked at was what we were calling overall vulnerability. And this begins to expand beyond the site boundaries and more into the community and environment down gradient and in vicinity of an area. And so here we combined site vulnerability, which we identified before. We would obviously first calculate that, and add to that community and environment sensitivity factors. And the data we used for the community environment sensitivity variables were population density data, vulnerable components of the population in vicinity to a site. We looked at elderly, ratios of children, sensitive infrastructure. We look for in close proximity within 500 feet of a site of hospitals or schools. We look at drinking water resources and protected water aquifer areas, and then other protected natural resource areas identified within data that are cover the whole Massachusetts area. So these are agency standardized data throughout. Those allowed us to understand like what is roughly in the vicinity of a site. If there was uncontrolled release, what potentially could the impacts be, and maybe how could those community begin to respond and guide some response at the site level. So the overall output of this is a large database table, which I will go through in a few slides here. But what we're able to do is create a summary at the state level. And again, this is a regional or a state level approach put together by, supported by MassDEP. So we weren't looking anywhere particular. So the way we were able to present and share data is kind of in a generic way, but to get an idea of what's going on throughout the state. And of course, what MassDEP was interested in is of these thousands of sites that we have to manage, how do we begin to address a prioritization approach to building resilience in sites? We want to be able to identify some factors that allow us to pick out what are the most vulnerable sites based on the information we have on hand right now, and begin to focus on and begin to improve the resilience at those sites to protect people around them as much as possible and the environment around them as much as possible. So it gives an overall view of the state. That's what I'm going to share here. But I will go through some of the site-by-site data at the end. So just looking at the site vulnerability itself. So again, we're just looking within the boundary of the site. So this is just specific to the first vulnerability model that I've described. And looking at specifically exposure. Again, we had to have this threshold of exposure to flooding or inundation because of storm surge or future sea level rise. Only 2,388 of the 6,001 sites, about 40%, seem to see have some potential for exposure to flooding or inundation, either now or into the future. And of those sites, looking down below, we broke them down, just a clean division, even division between different categories of low vulnerability, moderate vulnerability, and high vulnerability based on just site sensitivity and site exposure data. And I'll talk a little about how we summed those data and create a numerical output in a second. So as you see, you look at the whole state here, you can see obviously in the urban areas and the more industrial areas are sites, more numerous sites, and in the coastal areas you see ones that are more vulnerable, mostly because we're adding storm surge and or sea level rise to that exposure equation. So the data is also shared at a county level within the report. So we have site vulnerability at the county level. So again, this is the Boston Harbor area and vicinity, and begins to identify the sites a little more closely. These maps, again, are not supposed to be, pinpoint perfect, but they do begin a community at the city level, a community level, or a regional level, begin to examine, oh, okay, I do have a handful of sites that tend to have a higher vulnerability in my neighborhood or my jurisdiction or whatever. So again, that begins to flag, I need to go look at some of those sites and then go look at a more specific site-by-site data results, which I will show in a minute. Overall vulnerability results include the community environmental sensitivity components to them and kind of augment what was there at the site level. Again, these are looking at more broadly what's going on in the city around that site or those sites. And as you see, and we'll zoom in and get a little bit in the Boston area. There are quite a few sites that hit that high vulnerability level. Again, the breakdown of low to moderate to high vulnerability is based on just kind of even split of the data, just to give people an idea of what that may look like relatively. Again, you see higher sites in coastal areas, mostly because of exposure, and higher vulnerability, overall vulnerability in urban areas, just because of the population density and components of potentially sensitive portions of that population. And again, going down to Suffolk County, looking specifically here, quite a few sites kind of trigger high vulnerability status, and again, fit those categories I was just describing of higher population density, coastal or areas subject to sea level rise and other storm surge type situations. So again, maps just give you an idea of what may be in your neighborhood, and then how do you begin to drill down and identify site-by-site information. And again, if this is just a presentation at the agency level, I might just kind of stop here, but since you are folks who work at the ground in managing sites, making decisions and working with property owners on how best to build remedies at the specific sites to meet certain insults or potential insults, you'd be interested in actually looking at data and the data results themselves. And so the results table is a large matrix of information, and it's also available as a complement to the written written report. And in a couple slides, we'll tell you how you can access these results in the report. But it's broken into a long row for each of the 6,000 sites, which have a handful of information in there, which are drawn from the MassDEP database. So these are very specific to their database categories, but I'm sure any other state will have a similar database of sites with kind of similar information, and so you can kind of do a cross comparison or interpretation for that. I'm going to focus here on one site. The database is broken into site, environment, community, and then data summation sections, and I'll go through each of those. For example here, the Gulf Oil Terminal site in Chelsea, outside of Boston, is one I've just used an example here. And these are the site parameters we gathered from the overall database and brought through the project for each of the locations. And if you can go down here, you'll see the site sensitivity score of 2 for this, based on our site sensitivity scoring model. And it receives a 2 because it's an open site. It's an active site. It's under active management. It also receives another point for it has an imminent hazard pathway that has been identified within the site. So again, this is just a heightened level of management and concern for the site. Again, so with those triggers of potential increased sensitivity to inundation or flooding. So, but the site does not have any active remediation systems in place or some of the other things that would trigger a higher site sensitivity score. But what drives this site is we move forward in some of the other factors of dealing with obviously climate exposure and also the community and environment receptors in just a sec. Climate exposure for the site is actually quite high, mostly because it is in a 100-year flood zone based on FEMA. And it's also in the hurricane surge zone 1, so it's highly susceptible to, in this case, a category 1 hurricane inundation because of storm surge. It is also in sea level, potentially future sea level rise zones of sea level rise of 2 feet and higher. So that gives it a pretty high climate exposure score. And this site is actually right on the shores of Chelsea Creek and Mystic River area. So again, it's right at sea level and the tidal area. So exposure potential is quite high for this site. And you begin to see how we look at the site-specific level information and be able to learn something about the site that helps you identify what vulnerability will be, which you can't really garner from just looking at the map figures. From a community receptor point of view, again, it scored fairly high for that. The population density is quite high there. The relative proportions of elderly and young and children is high. It's also scored fairly high at an environmental justice index for that region. So again, those add to the vulnerability. There's lots of people nearby. There are no schools or hospitals within 500 feet, which is certainly helpful in this case. But there are a lot of housing that are close by and potentially sensitive portions of the population. Looking at environmental receptors, the handful we're going to look here actually scored 0 from that. But I think this is interesting. And again, this is based on data that are available for that region and that location, and within that there are no critical natural habitats or landscapes identified, core habitats identified there through Massachusetts agency indexes. From a water supply point of view or sensitive water feature point of view, also nothing in close vicinity either. But what I use this opportunity to identify the fact that this is an interesting result from an environmental receptor point of view, because the site is right on the banks of Chelsea Creek, off of the Mystic River. So it is certainly in close vicinity to a water body. And in this case, potential flooding because of that, but also any releases that could occur could end up in that water body and then downstream from there. So again, this is not perfect. It also does identify the fact that putting your feet on the ground and using site-specific reports and data and information to further inform any kind of decisions around resilience building and adaptation, it needs to happen beforehand. And it also shows that an approach like this is really good at just first-level screening, but you do need to do that on-the-ground work. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Kathy, who is beginning to kind of elaborate a bit what's the relevance for this in Massachusetts and how it might make sense to site managers and agency folks as an example of how this information can be used, obviously, within Massachusetts, and then how Massachusetts is beginning to use information like this and drive resilience building and remedies as an example that could be used elsewhere in the country or the world, for that matter of fact. So, Kathy, if you're ready, please take on over, but I will advance slides for you when you let me know.
All right, thank you, Eric. So I joined the project team from the mindset of a remediation engineer, always wanting to understand the how and why, and of course, how to make the process more efficient. And so we dive into this. We have to answer a number of questions throughout the entire remedial project lifecycle as we're evaluating and planning for the future. Will our remedy hold up? Is the site or remedy vulnerable? Do I have enough information to design for these vulnerabilities that Eric just walked through? So really, as Eric mentioned, it's a screening tool, and it provides that first step. Next slide, please. So really the overall messaging, and being part of the ITRC team as well, is to integrate resilience at the beginning and throughout the remedial project lifecycle. So Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection does have proposed regulation changes that do dictate the integration of climate change resilience into the regulations in 3 specific spots. The first is the conceptual site model, which is evolving throughout the entire remedial process. The attainment of permanent solution, as well as the definition of the foreseeable period of time. So the next few slides, I'll walk through the proposed regulation changes, just to give a little taste of where they've integrated this and how it will apply and how we can use this tool to help with that. So next slide, please. So these 3 slides that I'm going to walk through, certainly not going to read through them, but they're going to show where the integration of resilience has been added to these regulation modifications. But I do want to call out the big picture kind of summary of what it means in that top box in each of these. If you're interested, you can take a look at the PDF of these later, and you can see where the track changes shown in the red font are to the actual regulation. But the first is the conceptual site model, and really changes to the site and the risks posed by the site need to include these impacts from climate change, and it needs to be a component of the site's CSM throughout the project. Next slide. So with respect to the response action performance standards, and you can see there's some minor edits throughout here, but I guess, Eric, if you click one more time, it really pulls out, they're looking to emphasize that anticipated climate change impacts are relevant to the selection and maintenance of a permanent solution. Next slide. And the last one is the definition of foreseeable period of time, and this aids to refine it to emphasize that the anticipated impacts of climate change are to be considered among reasonable foreseeable changes in site conditions. So each of these has been integrated into the regulations, and I believe they're hoping to get these finalized by the end of this calendar year. It's really being able to give that our environmental professionals, we need to integrate this within the whole process. So if you can go to the next slide, Eric. So I'm gonna, before we walk through where those regulation changes fit in within the Massachusetts framework, I did want to put in a plug for the work for the Sustainable Resilient Remediation team at ITRC. And this is a draft snapshot of what will be an integrated web-based resource that will walk through each of the general steps of the project lifecycle. So Eric, if you could advance through this, and this is all still draft, it's an ongoing work product that this team has been actively going on, Barbara and Betsy, myself and Eric, as well as many others. But just as an example, right, that we have the project planning. So say you're in your project planning stage, working on your conceptual site model, you're engaging your stakeholders. This initial screening tool would fit in, within your exposure scenarios and assessment as you're developing your investigation scope. So making sure that, you're assessing, okay, what are my vulnerabilities of the site and the community, and am I collecting the right data so that I can make those decisions down the road. Won't walk through the rest of this, but I will note that it is scheduled to go out to public review this summer. So keep an eye out. Next slide, please. So bringing it back to Massachusetts and the MCP process, this is a slide from the MassDEP website walking through the MCP process. I've added a couple of broader remedial life cycle terms to the flowchart for those not familiar with the Mass process. So you can see there, it's all very similar. Most projects do follow a very broad process, but really the message is we need to integrate this resilience throughout the entire piece, primarily through that conceptual site model, and then ultimately attaining your permanent solution. We want to obviously start in the beginning, but many of our projects are already in the middle, and this tool, regardless, will provide you a great starting point no matter where you are. So, specifically, if you go in there and your site's vulnerability ranking is on the higher end, our hope is that you'll delve a little further into what it is and why it's making your site a little bit more vulnerable. So, exactly what Eric just went through, figuring out, where that scoring is higher and how do you take that into account with your remedy. Next slide, please. So in addition to the LSP community working on oil and hazardous waste sites, another use of this tool within Massachusetts is through the Resilient Mass MVP program. So the MVP program, or Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, is a grant program through the state, and it provides support for communities to begin the process of planning for climate change resilience and implementing their own specific community-specific projects. So the state awards communities with funding opportunities to complete, at first step, their vulnerability assessment, and then once they become an MVP community, they can go in for grant money to develop their project-specific, their action-specific resilience plans. So for example, if, as part of this, if a municipality does have liability for an MCP, a hazardous waste site, that is potentially vulnerable, they can incorporate that into their overall MVP program and incorporate it into their project list for potential future funding. Next slide, please. So, wrapping this up, where do we find it? The report is available on SURF's public website, and I believe there should be the clickable link with the PDF of the slides. And then the spreadsheet database is available for SURF members in our member resources. It looks like the circles kind of moved on this particular slide view, but if you go into the membership portal, there's the row up at the top, it says member resources. Click on that and you can get access into the actual spreadsheet. Eric and I and Barbara, one of the things we've talked about, we'd love to have this become a GIS layer and be available. We haven't gotten that far just yet. Next slide. But moving further steps down the road is working with MassDEP and how do we update this tool on some frequency based on can we connect it direct to the database and get as sites have changed, or as more newer information on climate change data that becomes available. We want to be able to integrate that as well. And then obviously outreach. This webinar is a first start. It's obviously the audience is a lot of probably SURF members, but getting out there to the Massachusetts specific folks as well. So whether it's the LSPA or the MVP program. So I think some outreach is on the list. And then ultimately, how can we apply this to other states and communities? And while Eric walked through the MassDEP specific database components, each state's going to have that, but work through, how do you want to rate or rank, your specific state, and ultimately can generate a very similar model. So, next slide. And with that, that's what we had to present today. So thank you very much for joining us. At this point, we would open up for questions, which I think Betsy, I think you were, Kyle, we're going to lead.
Yeah, we'll wait for some folks to type in their questions, but I guess in the meantime, maybe I'll ask one is, does it account for like secondary impacts? So as sea level rises and maybe that changes land use, or as population densities move, is there kind of a fact? I mean, I'm sure there's a tool for that or a factor for that, but does that account for it in this tool?
And that's an interesting question, because you're beginning to kind of delve into the complications in response over time to certain situations or events at a specific site. And the tool itself does not. But it could lead to that point that if you have a high population density score component, and even look at some of the potential indices for response or vulnerability of that population density, you can get an idea of what that challenge may be. But no, it doesn't specifically ask or address what the longer term impacts may be in that situation.
Okay, I'm starting to get some questions, so I'll throw them out there.
Great.
Did you guys consider including other climate change parameters such as drought?
We did. We actually, so the group of us sat down, and from a kind of a potential and theoretical point of view, there was a whole bunch of things we wanted to include in this. We wanted to look at overall temperature trends. We wanted to look at kind of winter storm severities. We wanted to look at potential drought, dry periods. But what we found is right now, for Massachusetts at least, that the spatial resolution of data sets were not quite variable enough to, or fine enough to provide information at a level across the state that was helpful. I mean, there certainly are reports and data available from the National Climate Assessment that say that overall Massachusetts will become more more dry or more wet over time based on some of the modeling, but that doesn't allow us to show a differentiation between locations within the site or within the state. I mean, so we couldn't say that one part of Massachusetts is going to be more dry than another part of Massachusetts with confidence. So we weren't able to kind of do that comparison.
Sure. Another one for you. In the vulnerability assessment, did you assign different scores to different types of remedial technologies? And if so, can you describe the methodology for this?
I wish we could do that. For 6,000 sites, we were not able to really look at what kind of technology was in place. But you were certainly alluding to different technologies simply more sensitive than others. If you have a lot of electrical pumping on site, then sure, that would be something to be much more sensitive to than just kind of a passive volatilization system or something like that. So absolutely, and I would certainly at a site-by-site basis encourage folks to look at the sensitivity of the technologies that tend to be in place as part of that overall index. So you can certainly expand on that, but we were not able to because that kind of detail was not captured within the database.
And then, are you working with other states to generate a similar product? If so, which ones?
We would love to, and should get your name from the list there at the end here. Whoever asked that's a good question. We have proposed some work in California, in the San Francisco Bay Area, to do a similar kind of relative site ranking throughout that kind of watershed that is the San Francisco Bay, and have not been funded yet. But we do have very curious partners who are involved in pushing that forward. So be happy to expand this further, and we're trying to use and leverage the outreach we're doing now, and obviously the interest here in Massachusetts to do that. There tends to be a synergy of on-the-ground need and kind of grassroots expectation and need for this kind of information, both at the community level and at the kind of the consultant and engineering level who drive a lot of the decisions, and then a top-down kind of requirement to be considering climate. And there's only a few states that really have put that together well, of which Massachusetts has been a leader, California also, and Washington State to some degree also. I'm sure there are others that are beginning to emerge more. So we're hoping that the questions that are being asked begin to be answered by an approach that we've developed like this.
Great. No.
And then
go ahead.
I just want to say, and again, Barbara or Kathy, if you've got anything to add to these, please jump in or steer me in a better direction. I'm totally open for that.
Well, we talked a bit at the beginning about the GAO report saying there is a need, as one of the participants said, about looking at the type of remedy and the length of remedy. And also, here in the San Francisco Bay Area, there have been vulnerability assessments, but there's always the caveat, as you see in the GAO report, we've done this high-level screening analysis in the port area of Oakland. But what we really need is, site-specific scenarios, analysis, or cluster of sites. So definitely there's the need that's been expressed, and as Eric said, the funding is needed also.
And so I guess on the more micro level, there's the question of, so can the analysis be scaled or downscaled site specifically to inform decisions on resilience measures? And if not, what is missing?
We actually began to explore exactly that. And it relates very much to some of the questions that have already been posed here, is what is the history of a site and learning about different remedies that have been in place. And Barbara said too, I mean, the Gulf Oil Terminal site, as an example I used I just pulled out of a hat, was interesting location because as you begin to delve down, it's a long history of over 100 years of industrial work there. And so when you begin to dig down and begin to really learn about the site and learn about the kind of the evolution of a conceptual site model there, and then what remedies it put in place, you can build that out. But we're not able to do that, obviously, for the number of sites. But I do encourage people to take a general approach of what are potential exposures from climate-related impacts, and then what are the sensitivity indices that you want to inform based on the information you have on hand. And I do step back, and I just put on a bit of a promotion for the organization I work for, EcoAdapt. We specialize and have been for over a decade now just in climate change vulnerability and adaptation strategy development work for built environments and their natural environment. And that's the exciting work. It is how do you begin to look at these complicated situations and come up with a suite of potential solutions that build resilience, that either improve a habitat, make something or make a community more resilient to some of the climate impacts they're already seeing and into the future. So certainly you can use those kind of approaches at the site level, and we certainly encourage it, and that's what we want to do. We feel that in some degree hazardous waste site management is a little bit behind that curve, but it's not because of the creativity and expertise that are there. It's just that really that the awareness and adding another level of complexity to already a complex process can be daunting to some degree. So we certainly encourage you as SURF leaders to take these ideas and information out into your work and make sure that it's there. Because, of course, you want to build resilient systems that meet society's and your clients' needs without surprises into the future. So I think for all of the above, there are good reasons to begin to make this kind of effort as more information to support it becomes available.
And I think one of our great follow-up questions to that then would be, have you engaged with any site managers for sites with high vulnerability, and how has their receptiveness been?
Kathy, I might send that one over to you because you're more feet on the ground than I am.
Well, I know that was one of our initial kind of goals, was to select, one or two of these sites and kind of really dive into it. And we haven't done that quite yet. Done kind of an overview, looking at it. I think, Eric, you had looked at a couple of those sites, but not talking with the actual, LSP or PMs. I know that, from my standpoint, I'll pull up and look at some of the sites that our group looks at, and we've tried to, at this point, we've just kind of taken in the data, are looking at it. Okay, what do we need to, when we look at either an existing remedy, or as far as, we're looking to design a remedy, right, where, what more do we need to, dive into? So if we've got a higher score, okay, is it driven by, the site location, or is it driven by the contaminants? Is it by the what's surrounding it? And really understanding that. So it's a good first look at, all right, what's the initial driver? And it gives you that comfort level of, okay, yep, we had that in our mind, or, oh, all right, I hadn't thought about that. So I think it's a really useful tool in that sense, that it gives you just another piece of information. Did I answer that all right?
Great.
And I guess maybe a follow-up to that would even be, then what do you see some of the largest hurdles for other states implementing this into their regulations?
Well, I think I guess there's two things, there's having this tool versus the regulations. And I think from the tool standpoint, it's, what do you have in your database, and the accessibility to that, and what kind of information to be able to rank if there's going to be a potential issue from a site specific. Clearly the surrounding community and the web surge and flooding potential, that's all available information out there. But from the regulation standpoint, I mean, I think, Massachusetts has done a nice job being kind of that forefront and getting it in there. And, the ITRC group has been kind of weeding through all the different, state policy and guidance. And I don't think there's very many that have. And so I think it's bringing it unfortunately probably will take, these examples that Eric had showed earlier, some of these major storm events that have caused the flooding and major disruption, to get that to the forefront.
And I'd add to that, for Massachusetts, the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, several of the communities, and this program's been going on for several years now, but several of the communities have identified within their own planning documents that they do have hazardous waste sites within their borders, and they have questions about them. And they don't have the information even to get started with that. So it's those questions are being driven by some of these extreme events, Kathy and I was just talking about and I mentioned earlier. And with that awareness and concern, questions are being asked. And I think that's going to be driving a lot of the next steps, because these communities are a little worried about how those sites are being managed and what the complications are, because they're beginning to learn those sites were managed for standards and environmental conditions that are obsolete now to some degree. And so they would like to see changes made. And so EcoAdapt is beginning to work with some of those communities, hopefully in the next year, to begin information to help bring in information and more specific information to help them answer those questions. And then step out and go to MassDEP, go to the site owners and managers and say, hey, these are our concerns. Let's work together on coming up with a solution that's good for everyone.
And I would add for California, particularly the urban areas, Los Angeles and San Francisco Bay Area, reuse housing is going to drive these vulnerability assessments and making sure that whatever is put on those sites, it's going to protect the bay, the people. So I think the drivers will be different, but again, kudos to Massachusetts for being a leader on the hazardous waste side, including, well, that's the subject of our talk today. So thank you.
We still have a few questions left, but I want to leave time for Betsy, but I'll try to get to one or two more. But one is just about the tool. They're curious to know more about the environmental justice parameter, and is that something your team determined?
This was a variable that was identified as available in the Mass GIS database, and I think the EJ scoring methodology has been developed and is used nationwide to some degree. I don't know the history of it, so it's no. The short answer is no. EcoAdapt or the partners did not create that. It's an index that's fairly available and fairly standardized at this point, and I don't know the direct parameters that drive it.
Likely the EPA in my community GIS database that's been around for a few years.
Great.
And then there seems to be a number of sites that can be vulnerable, but EPA released a report that of the sites they surveyed recently, very few had impacts, and most impacts were related to fences that needed repair. Aside from the slide in the intro, is there a compilation of other serious impacts that have been reported? It seems like that information is needed to get attention of site owners and practitioners.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I would turn people toward the ITRC guidance that's going to emerge in about a year or so, because we are collecting kind of the scattered information that to help inform things from case study point of view of identified problems and solutions that have been put in place, but also kind of the technical and complications that are a part of that, because what drives things are really data, and you need to have good data to be able to make the right decisions, and so you got to make sure that you are applying this as well as possible.
And kudos to EPA for all the work they have done on the climate resilience. But the sites and the reports, we're looking at NPL sites and some of the environmental damages and the integrity of the remedy. They didn't go into the environmental justice or natural resources indicators that we started in the screening tool. So I think the analysis were different than between the two, EPA and our.
Great, yes.
There's still a few questions left, but I want to be respectful of everybody's time. So maybe if you didn't get it answered, I can have somebody reach out and answer it for you, or you can feel free to reach out to any of the presenters directly with additional questions. But I appreciate you guys' time in the presentation and answering the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. Great questions and discussion. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you. If you want to go to the next slide, Eric. Thank you so much, Eric and Kathy and Barbara and everyone for your time today. A huge thanks to the participants for your thoughtful questions. There's nothing better than a Q&A that takes up the whole time because people are really excited and interested in the topic. If this webinar has inspired you to join SURF or at least get on the mailing list for future webinars, if you maybe received this as a forward, you can do both of those things on our website, and that website link is shown here. We also have four webinars in our backlog. Those are posted to our YouTube channel. There's an introduction to SiteWise, a reflection on 10 years of sustainable remediation, a discussion on the social side of sustainability, and a case study featuring solar-powered SBE. And those are all really good. Next slide, please, Eric. Looking forward, our next scheduled webinar is going to be June 14th, and this is going to be another great one. We're going to be hearing from SURF UK about a recently released guidance. We've also been increasing our webinar frequency given the state of the world, and so we're hoping to put these presentations out monthly. So here you can see our plan for the next several months. I also want to take one moment to mention that the call for abstracts for the 30th Annual International Conference on Soil, Water, Energy, and Air, also known as AEHS West, is in progress. And SURF as a partner with this conference, we're going to be hosting several sustainable remediation sessions. So if you're interested in submitting an abstract, the deadline for submissions is July 1st. And the AEHS website has all of that information. Last slide. Lastly, just a huge thank you to our sponsors. None of this, including the initiative that was discussed in today's presentation, would have been possible without the support of our sponsors. And a special shout out to TriHydro for providing webinar platform support today. We couldn't have done it without you. So thank you all again for joining us and hope to see you next month.